The bullet, a frontier surgeon could manage. A lead ball pushed tissue aside. It left a wound channel the surgeon understood. It could become encased in scar tissue and remain inside a man indefinitely without killing him. There were soldiers walking the frontier with lead in their bodies from wounds sustained years before. The body, given time and enough constitution, could negotiate a truce with a bullet. An arrowhead offered no such negotiation. In 1862, United States Army surgeon J.H. Bill published his findings from Fort Defiance, New Mexico. 22 pages drawn from treating living patients and examining the dead. His conclusion required no qualification. Arrows, he wrote, inflicted wounds, with a fatality greater than that produced by any other weapons, particularly when surgical assistance cannot be obtained. This is the history the frontier actually produced, not the legend, not the mythology, but the unvarnished record of what men did, what it cost them, and what it cost the people who stood in their way. The arrow's construction was the source of everything that followed. Plains Indian arrowheads were shaped from flint, obsidian, bone, or traded metal, razor-edged in ways no bullet ever was. The point sat in a split cut into the wooden shaft and was bound with sinew, the dried tendon of an animal, wrapped wet and contracted tight as it dried. Animal hide glue and pine pitch sealed the wrapping. Dry conditions were the operative phrase. Once the arrow penetrated a body, it entered an environment of blood and tissue fluid. The sinew began dissolving within minutes. The hide glue followed. Captain H.S. Kilburn, an Army surgeon, documented the consequence in 1881. The fastening is softened by the fluids of the body, and when not at once extracted, the head becomes loosened and is detached when extraction is attempted. The shaft came out. The head stayed in, loose, stone-edged, moving with every breath the patient drew. 8. A bullet the body could wall off. An arrowhead it could not. The rough serrated edges of a flint point could not be encapsulated by scar tissue. Every shift the patient made drove those edges into new tissue. Every breath, every attempt to sit up. The body's own inflammatory response, its attempt to expel the foreign object, produced an abscess that the arrowhead's constant movement prevented from closing. Infection did not threaten. It arrived. The only question was whether it arrived faster than a surgeon could. Dr. Bill left no ambiguity about the surgical obligation. We might as well cut the patient's limb up until we do find the arrowhead. Finding it was the first problem. The wound channel closed behind the arrow's passage, compressed by surrounding tissue to the diameter of the shaft, giving the surgeon nothing to follow but his own fingers working blind through live tissue. No imaging, no probe sensitive enough to navigate reliably. A man on a table with whatever whiskey the camp possessed in him, awake, while a surgeon worked a narrow track by touch alone. And that was the straightforward case. When the arrowhead struck bone, and many did, driving into rib, scapula, skull, or the long bones of the limb, the compact tissue gripped the rough stone and held it against any traction the surgeon could safely apply without destroying what surrounded it. Dr. Bill's answer was a set of forceps with jaws bent at right angles, not pulling. Gripping sideways, catching the arrowhead's widest dimension perpendicular to the wound channel and rotating it free rather than dragging it against the tissue that held it. A tool designed specifically for this problem, in this country, for these wounds. When bone had to be entered, when the skull itself had captured the point, the instrument was a trephine, a cylindrical bone saw. The surgeon cored through the skull around the embedded arrowhead, creating a hole larger than the wound, extracting the point from the access he had made himself. Army records documented soldiers who survived arrows to the skull. They survived because a surgeon reached them in time to cut through the bone that was keeping the arrowhead in place. The field kit available to that surgeon contained whiskey, lint, and whatever carbolic acid had reached the post, which, in the 1860s and much of the 1870s, was none. Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods were not Army standard practice. until years after the worst of the frontier wars. Surgeons packed the wound, waited, and watched for the fever that told them the infection had outrun the extraction. Infection was not a risk on the frontier. It was a scheduled arrival. The surgeon's only variable was whether he had removed the cause before it got there. Arrow wounds to the chest or abdomen carried mortality rates that no available treatment could substantially change. The arrowhead that separated from its shaft inside the thoracic cavity, resting against a rib, moving with each breath, working its edges into lung tissue with every inflation, produced a wound the surgeon could not safely reach and the body could not localize. Dr. Bill had examined these men. He had written his conclusions in the flat, careful language of a man documenting something he could not yet fix. The men who survived arrow wounds survived on constitution more than medicine. Physical condition built by years of outdoor labor gave them a margin the wound had to consume before it reached a lethal threshold. If the sinew had not fully dissolved, if the shaft and head came out together and the surgeon recognized his luck before the window closed, a man had a reasonable chance. If the arrowhead was already loose when he reached the table, the variables narrowed considerably. Many did not survive. The arrow in the hands of a trained warrior at close range was accurate, silent, and rapid. 6 to 8 shots in the time a soldier with a Springfield could manage one reload. And it left behind a wound that a capable surgeon could spend an hour inside without certainty that he had resolved it. The Army surgeons who worked the frontier posts understood the warriors who carried those weapons. They had studied them, treated the wounds they produced, documented the results with the specific, exhausted precision of men whose paperwork was filled with cases they had lost. What kept them up at night was not the warrior. It was the stone he left inside the man on the table, still moving, still cutting, long after the fight was over.